play the violin is not an uncomplicated process. In fact, doing something as simple as keeping your bow completely straight while playing is something that honestly can take quite a bit of concentration. However, what if I told you that you are actually making it more difficult than it has to be? I'm Tobias Murphy, and this is Murphy Music Academy. Okay, so I'm kind of lazy and really just want to get this video done, so let's just jump into it. Number one, but not lazy enough to not go ahead and plug my stuff first. So, of course, if you like the video, like the video. If you have any questions, put it down in the comments. I'm pretty good at answering those. Also, if you're interested in probably the best way to find out if you're doing things that are making things more difficult for you, then of course you can always sign up for Skype lessons. I will have my contact information in the description below. And of course, if you live in the Southeast Michigan area, then you can come by for real lessons. Okay, now number one. You are making your string crossings way too big. Now, in all likelihood, this is because you were taught at the beginning to think of string crossings in terms of different arm levels, G, D, A, and E. And that's not a bad way to start out, especially if you're a young beginner and it's easier to comprehend things in bigger motions. For instance, I have my younger students begin, and probably a lot of you do too, with the bow hold where the thumb is on the silver part of the frog right there. However, I don't allow them to play that way forever. As a matter of fact, as soon as they're able, I switch their thumb to the real position. And the same thing applies to string crossings. For example, let's take the biggest string crossing you could imagine, going from G string to E string. Now, if you're taught the arm level method, then you're going to go from here all the way down to here. However, it doesn't actually have to be that far apart. You can go from G string to E string, and that's all the distance you have to move. Like I said earlier, playing the violin is very complicated already, so any amount that you can reduce extra motion is going to make you into a better player. Now, of course, you might wonder, well, how do I go about fixing this problem? And the answer is to allow your elbow to follow the string crossing instead of lead. For example, let's take a very simple string crossing going from E string to A string. Now, if you'll notice, the distance between E and A, I can actually move using other joints, my wrist joint and also the rotational movement of my arm from the elbow down without having to move my elbow at all. So step one is to first recognize that the strings are actually not that far apart, and step two is to start trying to use smaller joints. Now, of course, there comes a point in which I am going to have to move my elbow, but that is where we get to letting the elbow follow instead of lead. So if I want to go from E string to D string, my elbow is going to move a little bit, but it is going to follow the initiating motion of these joints here. So going from E to D, or even E to G. But the amount my elbow ends up moving is probably no more than an inch. Now, you might think that the only reason you need to be thinking about this is if you're going to play some complicated string crossing passages or something like this. However, this can affect you even in simpler music, where I've had students that have come to me where they have trouble making a consistent sound once they're playing a passage on the A string whenever it switches to the D string. To help even out your sound, learn to make your string crossings as small as possible. Number two, and continuing in the same vein of inefficiency, you are raising your fingers way too high off the fingerboard when you play. Just like in the bow, we want our fingers to move in the smallest and most efficient way possible. So for this means that you keep the hand relatively in the same shape while you're playing, and you move the fingers just a little bit up and down from the bass knuckles. If you are having trouble playing anything a little bit faster than normal, or having trouble playing things cleanly, this is likely your main culprit. You are lifting your fingers too high up, and when you need them to be there at the fingerboard, they are far, far away. So here's a quick rundown of proper finger motion. First, your fingers ideally should be hovering above their spots on the strings, roughly above their spots on the strings at all times. So this is what we call hand frame. I made a video about that a few videos ago. You can go check it out. Then, once your fingers are nicely above their positions over the string, when you lift them up, you want to lift them up just enough to where they're still above the strings. Because obviously, if you want to look at the fingers here, if you lift them up too far, they end up angling backwards, not straight above the string, backwards. You only need to lift them up about that much. Now, the facility gained by doing this should be fairly obvious to you why that would work that way. However, another added bonus that you might not have thought about of making sure your fingers are always close to the fingerboard is intonation. Because think about it, it's much easier to aim if you're trying to hit a point from here to here than from here to here. Now, going back to the bow for number 3, your right elbow just generally sits too high. The best method of sound production is much like when we were doing string crossings. You want it to follow the bow instead of forcing it to your will. This means that your sound production needs to start with the idea that you are going to have the bow at an angle to where all of the weight of the bow at any given time can just sit comfortably on the string instead of being taken out of or being pushed into by the position of the arm. Using just the natural weight of the bow to produce the sound as the basis of your sound production produces the most natural and beautiful sound, and also the easiest to work with technically. This means that you need to find a comfortable arm position a little bit below the center of gravity of the bow so that the bow can just sit on the string, and also so you don't have any extra tension in your arm. This means, by the way, that in general, your elbow is going to be a bit below your hand, which means that it's okay if you bend your wrist a little bit while playing, especially when you get closer to the frog. The great news is once you find this proper position, it usually is in a place where your arm just kind of sits naturally and comfortably, which allows you to just focus on the bowing itself. Also, this of course reduces tension that you were definitely having if you were lifting your elbow up too high. And it's a general rule in violin that the less tension you have while playing, the better you sound. Now, I do want to point out here, this does not mean that you go in the complete opposite direction and chicken wing and do something like this and jam your arm into your side. There usually is a place, usually maybe just naturally around here, maybe it's a little bit higher, but you're not super raising your arm, where the bow just kind of sits very comfortably with the violin, and it doesn't have to be here, and definitely doesn't have to be stuck to your side. So don't go too far in the opposite direction. Find the nicest place for it to sit, and then learn to play with that. Now, for number 4, you might say, well, I was trying this stuff with my bow, and for whatever reason, I just couldn't keep the bow straight, or it just wasn't working, or when I got all the way to the tip, for whatever reason, I can't get there without making the bow crooked, and that very well could be because the angle of your violin on your shoulder is wrong. For a direct example, I have a student, a Skype student actually, so the way you work with them is a little bit different. You can only go off of what you can see instead of what you can move around physically with the person. So he was having trouble, and he is my height, so we should have roughly my wingspan. He was having trouble getting to the tip without hyperextending his elbow. And at first I thought, okay, well, we just need to move his arm a little bit out that way. He's taught himself to push in, because he did not start with me. He taught himself to move his arm inward as he was pulling the bow. So we did move the arm out a little bit, and it did start to help, but it still wasn't quite there. And that's when I realized that his violin was anchored too far back this way. Now, even though my most watched video is the video called How to Play Without a Shoulder Rest and Why You Should Care, I'm not really the anti-shoulder rest guy. I mean, I do prefer to play without one. I do prefer to teach without one. I have my reasons for why you should at least try it out, but playing with a shoulder rest doesn't make you a lesser player. As we all know, there are plenty of concert-level violinists who play with shoulder rests. However, in this particular student's case, he had his shoulder rest at an angle that anchored the violin back that way. And that is one of my gripes with shoulder rest, is that it doesn't allow much flexibility to move the violin with the bow. So if you are playing with the shoulder rest and you are having problems with the path of your bow, just no matter what you do with your bow, it's not working. It could be that you have the shoulder rest in a place in your violin that is pulling the violin too far in one or the other direction. It's probably too far back this way, but it's possible this way. Now, if you're not playing with a shoulder rest, that is probably an unlikely problem, though it still could be a problem, though it's more likely you'll just naturally bring the violin to where it needs to be. But if you don't play with the shoulder rest and you're having the same kind of problems, maybe think about bringing the violin a little bit more in. Now, the last thing that I want to talk about is going to seem a little bit different, a little bit surprising compared to some of the other things that we've talked about in this video. However, it's something I found to be very, very important, and that is that you might actually be overthinking everything you're doing while playing. Of course, there should always be a careful attention to detail, and sometimes that does take an exceeding amount of concentration. However, the best violin playing comes when you get to the point where you just feel what happens rather than have to think about every little thing. In fact, I would say that the main purpose of practice for anyone should be to increase the number of things they don't have to think about. If you think about it, you play something, you practice it a lot, and hopefully you get it to the point where it happens a little bit more automatically. Then you can add another thing that you can think about on top of that without having to think about the previous thing, and you just keep doing this, adding more and more things, and that's how you progress. However, I've met several students that get stuck on things, and it's not because they haven't practiced it enough, it's because they are too scared to sort of let it go into their muscle memory and their subconscious. In fact, I'd go so far as to say that the violin in some ways can smell fear. If you aren't convinced that what you're going to do technically is going to work, the violin is going to do just about everything it can to make sure that comes true. That means a certain amount of your practice should be geared towards the psychological, should be geared to kind of just letting loose and letting go and just seeing what happens. For instance, if you take something like shifting, even some basic shifting, let's say from first position to third position, which is where most people start with shifting, sometimes I will see my students do these little weird things with their wrists, these little extra motions. And you might think, well, I want to tell them, hey, you don't need to be doing those extra motions. Extra motions, as I said earlier, cause you problems. They make your playing inefficient. However, I don't actually need to address those extra motions. What I need to address, because in that instance, it's not a problem with technique, it's a problem with apprehension. It's a mental issue. They are scared they're not going to hit the shift, so they do all these extra little motions that they hope, at least maybe deep down inside, even if they don't actually realize it, they hope those little motions are maybe going to catch them if they fall. Another place I see this a lot is with students that feel maybe a bit uncomfortable with starting a bow stroke. So sometimes I will see them actually kind of almost give it a few goes. They'll kind of do a few circles before they start. And I often have to remind them that we have to stop completely before they even start playing and say, no, what you're going to approach, the way you're going to approach the violin is you're going to put the violin here, you're going to put the bow on the string, and you're just going to go come what may. Because when you are doing this, you are teaching yourself to not trust yourself. And like I said, the violin's complicated enough. You don't need to be scared while doing it, and you definitely don't need to make yourself even more scared by practicing insecurity. And that is what you are doing whenever you do any of these little, sometimes involuntary motions. You are practicing telling yourself that you actually can't do it, or at least you're making a bet with yourself that there's a probability that you aren't going to be able to do it. And you might say, but Tobiah, if it's involuntary, how do I practice it? Well, it may seem a little bit odd for me to say this as a violin teacher, but you have to practice screwing up. Of course, when I say practicing screwing up, that's not going out and intentionally making dumb mistakes. That means you're going to practice whatever thing you are scared of as if you do not care whether or not you hit it. You are just going to go for it, in other words. So let's say you're scared of the shift. So you're scared, you want to go from here and suddenly hit a first finger on third position, and it needs to be just dead on right as soon as you go. And you want the motion, because I'm telling you this, you want the motion to be simple. You want this to this. So instead of doing this and this, what you need to do is just practice going and then move your hand and just put your finger down and just say whatever note comes out, that's the note it's going to be. Oh, note was out of tune. Well, I'm okay with that. You've got to tell yourself you can be okay with it because you're practicing getting that apprehension out. And believe it or not, 99% of the time, you'll actually be more or less in the right place, and then you can just tweak a little bit and you'll get it right. And plus, you get rid of the fear because you practice being okay with whatever comes out by approaching the motion, by approaching the technique without fear. You have to get over being scared of making those mistakes. If you don't let yourself make those mistakes while doing proper technique, you're never going to learn proper technique. And preferably you find a teacher that doesn't get incredibly upset with you when they tell you to do something entirely new, and then when you do it and you screw it up, they get even more mad at you because they wanted you to be able to do it right the first time, even though you've never done it before. And oh, that's just enough about my childhood. Anyway, this has been 5 things that you might be doing to make your violin playing more complicated and more difficult than it has to be. Of course, the best way to find out whether or not you're doing things incorrectly to make sure that you have a streamlined progress in playing the violin is to go sign up for lessons. Doesn't have to be with me, like it if it was, but just go find a teacher out there somewhere, preferably a reputable teacher. Probably do a video on how to pick a teacher here pretty soon, but just for now, just go find a teacher. Just do it. It'll help. Of course, I've been Tobiah Murphy for Murphy Music Academy, where there is no pleasure in mediocrity. Happy practicing, and I'll see you next time.